don't marry a laborer, that's below you. Again, what happened, why, who the laborer was. Could it have been somebody that worked here? Could he have been a Higginbottom? So again, these are stories, and that's what you look for the evidence. You try to find the evidence in records of birth and death, in journals, in town records, in newspaper articles, and things like that. A lot of research and time goes into finding the source of, the support of a narrative.
Today we're going to look at how primary sources inform the stories that we tell. And given the nature of a lot of this research, the genealogy and the archival research can be really difficult, especially when we're talking Native Americans and people of African descent. So when we're talking today about the Higginbothams and the Randalls, they left a pretty good paper trail for us. There are wills and probate notes. There are inventories. And sometimes you run across a journal or a newspaper article. There are vital records. There's a lot of material. Sometimes a tantalizing little tidbit in the newspaper. But Jonathan Randall, they're scant material. It takes a different kind of digging. So we'll talk a little bit about that later. So we want to start with the shape of the land. Without understanding the geology and what's going on up there, we wouldn't have any history to talk about. This is the rocky backbone of the Mashmucket uplands that we're going to be visiting today. It is filled with boulder fields and some glacial erratics. It's got glacial till all over the place. It's not the best farmland. Some of it's arable, and you can see where there were pastures for cattle. There's barbed wire that went well into the 19th and 20th century. But the land does not lend itself to cash crops. So from the shape of the land, I want to go into what's in a name. This is a place that's had many different names. The names have evolved over time. All right, it didn't have a name when the Randalls and the Higginbothams lived there. They did not name their farms. It's a neighborhood. In the 1700s, it is not isolated. It is not a hideout. It is a very much a thriving neighborhood where there's several thoroughfares of traffic. The Randalls have their farm up on top of Ragged Hill, and Obadiah Higginbotham had bought his 10 acres across on the east side of the brook. They could see each other's houses because there were no trees. It is open. And there's the old King's Highway. People are traveling through there to get up to the post road, the Boston Turnpike. So there's a lot of traffic coming and going. George Washington, as we know, and Lafayette camped out between the Randalls' property and the Grosvenor's property. So there's lots of stuff going on here, not isolated. But we first start hearing about the place being a village, the village of voices. The first place that you see that in writing, it doesn't mean that that's the first time it happened in writing, is in 1927, when Odell Shepard, a poet and a writer from Yale, walks the northern perimeter of Connecticut on the border of Massachusetts, and he comes into Pomfret. There may be some written histories earlier that mention place names, but this is the first time we see reference to a village or the village of voices. When you read his book, he's very upfront that he has been reading Ouspensky. He's very much coming from the lens of that early 20th century spiritualism. And he's talking about the fourth dimension. So he's kind of already got a lens when he's writing this story. He meets up with a painter and a poet who are friends of his. They take him out to the village of voices, and they take a dip in the mill pond. His descriptions of the place are useful for a researcher because they give us a picture, a snapshot of what that place looked like in that time. A time when it was in transition, in old farm succession from being open pasture land to becoming forested once again, and the trees the forest is already swallowing up the roads and pathways and the trails. The trail from the cemetery is very scant. It was hard for them to find their way from the cemetery down to the brook. So we get a little picture of that. It's Odell Shepard that starts to verbatim, the stories that are told afterwards come from his poetry. When he's lying in the orchard and he writes in prose, imagine that you can hear the voices of the past, children laughing, women sobbing, dogs barking, wagons rolling by. And he writes this beautiful poem about it. So that lost village of voices, some of you, well, a few of you may have grown up in the area and probably had those stories passed down from parent to parent, grandparents. Some of you may have had grandparents from the 1800s, late 1800s, who were already going up there and calling it a lost village of some kind. The next reference to lost village, or a village that was somehow lost, was in Folklore and Firesides by Susan Jewett Griggs. Now, one of the things that people make a mistake all the time with Susan Griggs is that, oh, she made lots of mistakes, it's inaccurate. She's very upfront at the beginning of her book. It is a collection of oral history. It is a collection of stories from the people who lived in the neighborhood of the old King's Highway. You can see her traveling from Jericho, where the old King's Highway took a turn going off to Canterbury, up to the Ragged Hills. And she collects stories along the way. And sometimes she was able to get into the archives and back those stories up. To me, as a researcher and a historian, it's a treasure trove of tidbits of information to investigate. When I read her book, I take that information and I form a question. For example, in her book, she talks about Mary Webster and Lucretia Taylor, her two sisters who were descendants of the Randall slaves. When I saw Mary Webster, bells went off in my head because I've been doing research and work on Charles Webster, who was a member of the Connecticut Colored Regiment in the Civil War, and his little gravestone is in the middle of the Natchok Forest. And I'm thinking, I wonder if they're connected. Well, lo and behold, with some archival research, with genealogy, and with census reports, Mary Webster had married Charles Webster's younger brother. So all of her children, including the living descendants whom I've been in contact with today, in this time period, they are descended from the Randall slaves through Reuben Randall, and I'll talk about that later, the Lamberts and the Websters. So when you're working with folklore, the thing is to do the homework afterwards. And I think Ruthie Brown will tell you the same thing. If you're working with gravestones, you have to do the homework. If you're working with whatever data that you have, genealogy, you still have to do the homework and find the paper trail or find the archives that support your questions and your theories. So when you get to the 1960s, you get our friend Harry Chase, who was a local storyteller, raconteur, somebody who loved to get people going, amateur historian, loved going out to the lost village, which he called Barahak. There's no Barahak in any land record or anywhere. There's no Barahak. He's the one that came up with that name. And so he expands upon that because he was a really good storyteller. People loved hearing his story. Kids, Boy Scouts, everybody visited Harry Chase. And so he's the one that kind of accentuated all the stories and the mythology of Lost Village, in quotations, that we know. By the 1970s, the 4-H camp was using the term, had gone from Village of Voices to Lost Village of the Hills to Barahak, and then just the Lost Village. And so just the word alone, if you hear Lost Village, well, oh, there must have been a village here. There's a couple of cellar holes, so it must have been a huge settlement. But it wasn't. It was one homestead. It was the homestead of Obadiah Higginbotham, and his son later built a house on the property And so it appears, that there were more people there, but it's one family's homestead. As I said before, this is a thriving community. Everybody's interconnected. It's interdependence during the colonial period. People have different skill sets. They rely upon each other. I'm going to start with Edward Payne. Edward Payne is one of the early proprietors. He is a large landowner. He has a couple of little mills, a little grist mill, I believe a sawmill. I believe that on the Higginbotham, the first 10 acres, that Edward Payne had a sawmill there prior to Obadiah setting up his spinning wheel shop. There's evidence of an earlier mill at the head of Obadiah's mill pond and a laying out place for boards. In Edward Payne's inventory, he has a lot of chestnut boards, and so it makes me think that the 10 acres that Obadiah bought had probably been cut over, already cleared. His sawmill may have been there, and chestnut is a very important commodity. Many of the houses and barns have chestnut beams in them. In 1778, Obadiah buys 10 acres of land on the east side of Nightingale Brook from the heirs of Edward Payne. In Edward Payne's will, he had set aside 100 pounds of gilded Spanish silver for his 6 grandchildren. And he directed his heirs to sell 10-acre lots of land in his south lot to pay for that, so that they would have that 100 pounds of silver. So Obadiah buys one of his 10-acre lots for 100 pounds of lawful silver. By 1780, he has settled. So 1778, he buys the land, it's in the land records, and then we know he could have been here before 1780, but 1780 is when his son Darius is born in Pomfret. So that's a marker for at least we know he was living there by then. Dorcas, his wife, her last name is Green. She comes from Rhode Island. The Green family is somehow interconnected with Jonathan Randall. Obadiah didn't just come out of space and plop down here. These are people that are well connected, even though Obadiah is not wealthy. He is someone who's pretty much a laborer. He's a millwright and a carpenter, whereas Jonathan Randall is very wealthy, but they both come from Cranston. So Obadiah has something else in mind, and I think it's not just Obadiah. I think that Randall knows that Obadiah has a particular skill set that's really important. 1778 in Lancashire, England, the English Arkwright factory system is thriving and blossoming. It was thriving since the mid-1700s. Obadiah calls himself a millwright. He is able to harness water power. And so for some reason, he's got this connection to Randall, who might have believed that he could help him to get involved in some kind of textile industry. Even though our Industrial Revolution wasn't happening yet, don't forget, people are harnessing every single tiny little brook in Connecticut, northeast Connecticut, because that's where we have a lot of water power. They know how to harness water, and they're starting to talk about it and think about it. He comes to Boston in 1768 as an infantry soldier. He marries Dorcas in 1770. He's on the 1777 military census in Rhode Island, living in Cranston, issued a musket and a bayonet, willing and able to bear arms for the Continental Army. 1780, he's living in Pomfret. Lists himself as a millwright, mechanic. I love that term, mechanic. He produces linen spinning wheels. There's one of his wheels is up at Sturbridge Village, and he stamps it on the butt end. He's doing well enough that in 1790, he buys 100 acres more of land on the west side of the brook. And he buys that land from Seth Grosvenor. And that land includes the burial ground. And I think there's a reason why he bought that, because that would give him water rights on both sides of the brook. Because his sons, Darius and Ziba, are now coming of age, and they're also calling themselves millwrights and mechanics. So they have an interest in this industry. and perhaps expanding their industrial endeavors. When I look at genealogies or look at vital records, I'm looking for patterns. And one pattern that shows up in the Higginbothams is that from the period from 1802 to 1807, several of the family members died. So when they arrive here, they have Elisha, who was born in Cranston, Obadiah Jr. Obadiah Jr., there's no record of where he's buried. He died in Pomfret, age 1786, at age 11. Obadiah was born in Cranston. When she was born in 1778, the year that Obadiah buys the land, there's a smallpox epidemic. There are Hessian soldiers marching up and down the coast. They're occupying Newport. So I can't blame them for wanting to get the heck out of there. Darius is the one who ends up carrying on the legacy of his father's work and the farm. They had a daughter, Phoebe, who died in 1802, a daughter, Asha, who died in 1805. Obadiah dies in 1803. And then Obadiah dies in 1807. There's this pattern just about every year and a half that one of them dies. And I found a doctor's bill when Obadiah died in August of 1803 from Dr. Knight. The medicine that was used was some medicine that was used for drawing phlegm out of the chest. So that gave me a clue that, it could have been pneumonia, but there's a pattern here, and so I suspect TB. In the neighborhood, at the uplands of Mashmucket Brook, was Nightingale Farm, which is right on Raymond Hollow Road, Route 244, the former Boston Post Turnpike. That farm later became the toll house for the turnpike. Samuel Nightingale was one of the early proprietors, and he had that farm. He was living here in 1745 when he was elected one of the town clerks. He was elected a society clerk as well. And so Samuel has enslaved Africans, but he leaves town long before they are inventoried on the 1790 inventory. His son Joseph Nightingale was born in Pomfret, later becomes very wealthy, built a big mansion on Benefit Street in Providence. He became a merchant, and the merchant's ship business was very tied in with trafficking slaves. Samuel moves his family to Providence in 1751 and opens up a distillery, a rum distillery. Whenever you see rum distilleries, you know that there is enslavement involved, because it's part of that transatlantic slave trade in New England, and especially in Rhode Island. There were many families, many of these families that we're talking about, had ties to the slave trade in Rhode Island. So Samuel Nightingale's tie is that, of course, and the rum, the sugar, the slaves, the West Indies, the Caribbean, West Africa, they're all tied together. So in 1777, there's a neat little letter from Samuel to his sons, and he's asking them to find him some Negroes. And the reason why he wants to get some free enslaved labor is because he can't find any labor. He wants to make his farm in Pomfret more profitable. Well, why would he want to do that? What is it? It's 1777, in the middle of the Revolutionary War. And there's a business opportunity here if you have a nice farm in Pomfret. Randall is doing the same thing. If you run your sheep and your cattle, you're going to sell beef and mutton and wool to the Continental Army. Then there's the Cunninghams, who don't fit in with the Rhode Island slave traders. They come down from Boston in about 1779, and they do not, there's no record of them having enslaved labor. They may have hired out slave, there were many enslaved laborers who had particular skill sets, stonemasons, building chimneys, building dams, carpenters. So there may have been some of that labor. But Elizabeth Cunningham was Elizabeth Pierpont, and her grandfather was Thomas Morey, who was one of the original proprietors. She inherited land from him, and that is why I believe they came here. Peter Cunningham was a retired sea captain, and they built this fabulous mansion, which is renowned throughout Pomfret history. It's about 1785, I believe, when the mansion was complete. It was called National Meadows. When they first came here in 1779, they lived in a smaller house on their property that overlooked Taft Pond. Taft Pond still exists. I think Peter Cunningham is the one who first dammed up the pond and had a sawmill there. And his son, Peter Cunningham Jr., ended up living in that house and operated that sawmill. So you have them living in this smaller house, normal-sized house, while they're building this large house. So Jonathan and Patience, I wanted to talk a little bit about them because they are the wealthy family from Cranston. They have a lot of ties, and some of those ties, they're tied in with the Higginbothams somehow. That family interacted for generations, whereas the Higginbothams were the laborers or the borrowers of money. The Randalls were always, lending them money to do a business venture. And so you see this long-term relationship that's formed. Patience was born in Rehoboth in 1715, and Jonathan was born in Cranston, which was called Providence Village at that time, in 1706. They married in Rehoboth in 1737. Patience was a Bowen. The Bowens in Rehoboth, had moved into Rhode Island. They were very involved in slave trade. Her grandfather, who supposedly was involved in slave trade, gave her several slaves as a wedding gift. Jonathan Randall was a senator in Rhode Island. He was very involved in politics, and I think he was a justice. His title is Esquire. His original title was Captain. So this is just a little bit of their genealogy for the purpose of seeing who ended up with the property and why. So they had Patience and Jonathan had 4 children. Captain James Randall was well established in Johnston, Rhode Island by the time they moved out here. Apparently, Jonathan had given him a bunch of land and a bunch of his estate before they moved. Jonathan Randall was the only other son, and Jonathan Randall was supposed to inherit the estate in Pomfret. Jonathan was heavily invested in this farm. He had brought his wife, Amy Sprague, out here. They were married here in 1778. When Jonathan Sr. dies in 1791, there's nobody that he can pass the land on to because James doesn't want it. So it goes to George, James's son. And so George is the one, he and his descendants are the ones that hold on to that farm for the next 100 years. And then there's a mystery. This little guy here, I'm still trying to solve this mystery. Little Jonathan, there's no record of him anywhere. There's no record of him having a little boy, born in 1799, except that 2 years ago, out of the blue, there appeared a smashed gravestone against the wall in the cemetery. And it was curious. I took it home and pieced it together with my friend Donna Drash, who was here, like a jigsaw. And to the best of our knowledge, what we can figure out by the pieces that are left is that little Jonathan was born around 1799. He died. He was the son of Mrs. Patty and Mr. George Randall, who died in 1803 at the age of 4 years and some odd months. So it's curious that he never made it into the Hale records, and I believe that the reason is that by 1937, when they did that inventory, that gravestone was already prostrated and probably fallen down 100 years before. It was probably covered with soil. And the only thing I can figure out is that somebody who probably didn't belong there went with an iron pole because they were looking for gravestones and poked around and found that little stone, dug it up, and it was too broken to bother with, so they left it there. When I first started talking to people about this work and this research, a lot of eyebrows were raised. We didn't have slaves. And, people are sort of surprised, although we shouldn't be, because there has been a lot of work. There was that wonderful work that the editors and reporters of the Harper Current did 20 years ago called Complicity, where they looked a lot. But people didn't realize that we had many enslaved Africans right here in Pomfret, and more so than in Mansfield or Tolland. And the reason for that is because we were so tied with the migration of people coming over from Rhode Island, and those Rhode Islanders who had ties to the slave trade. But there were many people who had lived here for generations who still used enslaved labor. We have examples of that. There's various kinds of data where you can find it, including runaways. That it wasn't unusual for slave holders to offer a bounty for a runaway slave. You think of this happening in the South, but there are many examples of that happening in New England as well. So one of the pieces of data that backs up the Griggs story that Patience Randall was given slaves on her wedding day is that in the inventory in 1790, Jonathan Randall lists 3. Now, 3 is quite different than many, but they were given the enslaved Africans in 1737. This is a long period of time. So it's pretty likely that maybe they came with 2, 3, maybe 4 enslaved servants when they moved here. Seth Grosvenor, who lived in the neighborhood, had 1. Thomas Grosvenor had 2. And then we know also that there were enslaved Africans working the Nightingale farm, at least in the 1770s, and probably still there in the 1790s. Folklore that was passed down in the Griggs book was that the Randall slaves were buried in the cemetery. And it contributes to the mythology that was passed on by Harry Chase that they were one of the pieces of mythology is that they were upset that they had been put in unmarked graves at the back of the cemetery. And so they were haunting the place. And the other mythology that developed was that, and actually I think this one came down from the Lambert sisters, Mary Webster and Lucretia Taylor, that their family had passed down the story that the Randall enslaved were superstitious and they wouldn't walk past the cemetery at night. I really, really want to know who those enslaved Africans are. And I feel really, on a personal level, I feel committed. I feel like it's very important that we say their names, that we acknowledge their existence, because they haven't even had any acknowledgement at all. So part of the work that I've been doing is trying to identify their names. But the first step was to identify whether, in fact, there were burials down at the back of the cemetery where there's a bunch of little field stones. So the State Archaeology Department came out with their GPR, ground penetrating radar, and they did a survey of the whole cemetery. Burials in the back. Now, what does GPR tell us? It doesn't show you a casket. You have to be a soil scientist to read it, which is the young woman who did the survey. That's her. She's an agriculture soil scientist, and that's what she does. It shows you that there were disturbances in the strata of the soil. So yes, there are several graves back there. That hike is going to pick up the story from Reuben Randall, who was born in Pomfret, enslaved. So that's as far as the records get, but I've taken that record all the way up to current descendants living in the area. Reuben Randall actually married into a Narragansett family. So he married into Native American families, and his descendants married into the Lambert and Webster families, who were the Nipmuc and also the descendants of African slaves that lived out in the Natchok Forest and where this little gravestone is. William Lambert and Charles Webster were both soldiers in the Connecticut Colored Regiment in the Civil War. What I'm hoping will happen is that as I work on the other big project I'm doing is researching the soldiers, the black soldiers of the 29th Regiment. And I'm hoping that we will uncover more of those soldiers who go back to perhaps the enslaved Randalls or other enslaved people living in Pomfret.